Good morning. I'm Norman Foster. I'm an architect. My world is cities and buildings. I've learned that if you want to look far into the future, and I have great expectations for the future, that first you must look far back. This is a school of 56 nationalities from 6 continents. And you all take for granted mobility. You take for granted that you can go to Geneva and take an aircraft, or a high-speed train to Paris. But really, mobility is an invention from the past, from the 19th century, the early 20th century. In that sense, you're fulfilling the great expectations of those in the past. For example, this high-speed train is 1829. It's using the same tracks. In that sense, the train also on a gauge of 4 foot 8.5 inches, 4 foot 9 in Pompeii, with the tracks of the Roman chariots, which carried goods and people. So we all fulfill great expectations from the past, but the things that we take for granted, which we consider necessities, are really luxuries. Whether we turn a tap, whether we have water, switch an electric light, use a library, use a school, they're all inventions of that period. And those inventions and those discoveries are the results of individuals who had courage, who could look far ahead and plan for generations beyond their own lifetime, beyond the lifetime of their children. They could take risks. They had an appetite for big thinking. Those are the qualities that we need today for the future. This image is New York in the mid-19th century. I'm just going to take one example of an invention of that period. The public park didn't exist really before then. There were royal parks that opened to the public, but the idea of creating a park, Central Park, New York, was an awesome undertaking. 1,600 properties, draining swamps, using more gunpowder than Gettysburg to blast rocks. Huge, planting 3 million trees and shrubs. 16-year enterprise. And that park has anticipated change. It's seen the birth of the high-rise building, of the skyscraper. It was conceived for a city of 600,000. And today, that hosts 38 million visitors. It was planned in the days of the horse and cart, and it had bridges, which beautiful, brilliant design. It separated the carriages below and the park above. And today, it still functions. It was more than a park, it was a road network, there's a waterway system, reservoirs, and it is synonymous with New York. It is the green lung. And it's a reminder that New York is more than just green with trees, green in terms of ecology, sustainability, responsibility. It is the greenest city on the planet. And why? Because it's compact, it's dense. The compact city and the compact building, whether it's a Paris of Europe, a London of Europe, whether it's a Boston of America, New York, because everybody can walk, they can take public transport. So it is good in terms of the amount of energy that it consumes. It is the polar opposite of the sprawl which is dependent on the car. Los Angeles, for example, here, consumes 8 times the energy of a city like New York. And the pollution and all the issues of climate change, they're all related to the production and the consumption of energy in an industrialized society. What happened if you conceived of an experiment in a very hostile environment that was totally driven by the sun? And that, where would you start? you'd start with the locals and you try to learn from them. And they offer a lot of lessons. Interestingly, they come together like the compact city. They create shade and cools. And to create this mythical community, you would try to combine that with the most advanced technology of the day, which is probably typified by space, through which many of the new technologies have evolved. And you could say that trying to create a solar community in that most hostile of environments is like putting the man on the moon in terms of its challenge. And so you would start with an age where there were no power switches, no air conditioning. How did people in the past create an environment in the intense heat, 70 degrees of a desert, and create a cool house with none of the technology that we take for granted, and bring that temperature down to 27 degrees? So you'd start to look, and of course it is compact. It relates to the sun. The orientation creates shadow, the spaces create shade. And here we're using the most advanced technology to try to discover why they would build these wind towers. They would reach up to the cool air above the desert, collect the breeze. And if you look closely, you can see small courtyards. If you went into those courtyards, you would discover water, greenery, evaporative cooling, and there'd be delightful spaces and lots of privacy in this very, very tight community. I'm now going to show a very brief film. It's a mixture of some simulations and some real images. It seeks to reinvent the car to create a clean electric car, which is robot-driven. You've probably all been reading about that technology, which Google are advancing. It's very feasible. It separates the car at a lower level. It's active. There are 340 students, teachers, visitors in this community. So it exists. And this is the film, which starts with the electric vehicle. The electric vehicle goes into a charging bay. And then from that lower level, because again, the community is lifted up in the air to catch those breezes. So there's a world below there. You come to the world above it, you move through these spaces, you see the new technology, you see the concrete which is using the desert sand, and you see highly insulating materials which are cool to the touch, which have come out of the feedback from that technology. You just passed a wind tower, which was bringing cool air to a public space. You're going through an information center. You can see the factories. Remember, this institute called Masdar near Abu Dhabi is devoted to research into clean energy. It's a compact, it is literally a walled city, and here you pull away from it. The first two phases have been complete. You take for granted in that film that, like anywhere else, there would be public space. But what about those cities within cities? What about 1/3 of humanity, more than 2 billion people, who do not have those luxuries, do not have the luxury, starting first with public space? In a typical favela or slum, the only public space is a railroad track and the graveyard. There's a little film clip here which shows that reality. It's a thriving market street, or is it? It's actually the train tracks. And as the train advances, then the vendors pull back their wares, and the whole physical environment responds to the oncoming train. A reminder that this is an affluent community relative to the rural world where they've been attracted. Everybody is coming to the city because cities are the future. In 2007, more people were living in cities. It was a crossover. So this is a community with great pride, with civic values, and is, in relative terms, prosperous. If we wanted to try to understand a little about that very, very large slice of humanity and the physical place, Let's start with a suburb of Mumbai called Dharavi. It was incidentally the setting for the film Slumdog Millionaire. It is 175 hectares and it's approximately 1 million people. Put that in the context of this school. If we take that footprint, and you can see the yellow line, which is the size of the school, 1 million people. And the context is Roll, the nearest town is around 5,000. The nearest city, Geneva, is 194,000. Switzerland alone is 8 million. But this is typical statistic. 40%, 2.5 billion, have no sanitation, and half of those have absolutely no sanitation at all. No bathroom in the sense that we know. 20% more than 1 billion have no clean water. When we take a shower for 5 minutes, we use more water than anybody in one of these communities. And if anybody in this community, in that city, wants to buy water, it costs them 5 to 6 times the cost of a wealthy individual. And 3.5 million people die of water-related diseases a year. And 25% have no power, no electricity. They can't press a switch. So you would assume, as most architects, planners, social reformers, that the answer to this, to improve the quality of life, is to take a bulldozer and start again. And the little yellow circle there shows you the part of that community where they did just that. And they bulldozed it and they created it. These are the only water closets in that community, one for every 1,500 people. They're not used, it's empty because it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? It works for kids playing cricket. It's the only open space at the bottom. So we went as a small team, two of my partners, Narinda and Chris, and engaged with the local community to find out why and to try and understand that community. And that community processes 80% recycles the waste of Mumbai. It's a $1 billion enterprise, 10% of which is legal, 90% of which is black market, trading between traders. But it needs horizontal spaces. And our proposal was you encourage those horizontal spaces, you insert, you don't even excavate, you create tables, you put the infrastructure of sewage and water, and you legalize the areas, you create some open space and you transform it. And you transform it respecting the community, because it's a very proud community with extraordinary values. There's a certain irony here, because if that's Asia, Asia is also where we're seeing the big initiatives in terms of infrastructure, the big thinking that was typical of that 19th century, early 20th century period. Hong Kong threatened by overflight, incredible tales of 747s coming in, scooping the washing off the line of the balconies as they came in low over the city. And of course, to create a new airport, Hong Kong has no water. But that, in terms of that mentality, is no big deal. You take some water, you've got a mountain, you chop the mountain down, the mountain's 100 meters high, and you create an island. You create an island 6.5 by 3.5 meters. And it becomes then the largest airport in the world. And that airport is in its form evocative of flight. That in that part of the world, in terms of the big thinking and planning for generations far ahead, and moving with extraordinary discipline and planning, takes us. Here you can see the transition of that airport literally overnight. Barges, aircraft, again, extraordinary planning. And if we move to Beijing, then we can see an enterprise which eclipses that. And I want to put it into context by looking at the biggest in terms of a hub in European terms, which is Heathrow. But remember, an airport like Hong Kong is within 5 hours flying of more than half the population of the world. So these are big numbers. If you take Heathrow, it is 5 terminals. The last terminal on the far left over there took 17 years. If you look for a more sustainable approach, then it's a compact building, which means it's one building and not 5 or 6 or 7 separate buildings. And if we just superimpose Beijing, which is over 3 kilometers long, as a single building on that, and you realize that this building was built in 4 years with 50,000 people, and you compare that with a tiny terminal in Heathrow, it gives you an idea of the scale of the thinking and the enterprise. But it's also looking back to the roots of that culture. So it's cutting edge in terms of its technology, but it's also mindful. It's learning those lessons from the past, which I started with, and creating expectations for the future. So it is the roof of the Forbidden City, it's the colors of the temples, and it's heroic in terms of its scale, and it's celebratory. It is also about civic values and a pride in the future. It is connected 10 to 15 minutes by a high-speed train, and as you can see, it also has its green dimension. There's an extraordinary alliance between China and California in terms of the digital world, which you could argue is now the second revolution, the communication revolution, which we've been hearing about and which we take for granted in our everyday lives. California, Silicon Valley was originally a fruit orchard, and our work with Apple here is creating, again, the compact building, although it is very, very large, but it's one building instead of a typical campus of 30 or 40 buildings for 16,000 people. And it is being created by a partnership between California and China in the same way that the very products which come out of that are created. We use a lot of models. We communicate this project to the founders of the digital world in analog terms. The special thing about the model that you're seeing here is that it has been made by robots. And here are the robots and the computers that drive them. And the question raises itself, if you can make a model by a robot, could you do a total building by a robot? And we were approached in the most hostile of all environments, the moon. We're approached by the European Space Agency because of our pioneering work. And we partnered with a Dutch enterprise and an Italian enterprise and have created the first example of moon dust, a building material made with moon dust. In actual fact, the closest you can get on our planet to moon dust is volcanic ash. You mix it with glue, you create a material, it's called regolith, and here is how that will happen. You can see, and this can all be remote because you're flying out in space, just balloons which you inflate, and then the robots mix the regolith, which is moon dust, with a glue, and creates the habitation. The habitation, you can see it under construction, you see it here, it's proof against meteorites, solar radiation. It's the first lunar habitation and totally feasible and real. What are my expectations for the future? A future where everybody will be able to turn a tap and press a switch, because the consumption of energy is related to greater life expectancy, lower infant mortality, more freedom, sexual, political enlightenment, and that world will be powered by clean energy. The cars will be green, will be soft, the compact cities will prevail. Those are my expectations, but that will be achieved by future generations. So those expectations really fall to you, because your generation here and around the world, that will be your challenge. Thank you.